Thank you very much, Chris, for that fun introduction. I've been nervous about this all day, but I've already done the most difficult part of this talk. They put this microphone on me about 10 minutes ago. I haven't been able to say a word. So, anyway, let's get started. I want to start with a question, which may seem a little bit obvious. Should Scripture be understood in liturgy? Here, as we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, a Bible that was composed expressly so that the audience, the members, the congregation could understand the reading of the biblical text during worship, it seems to be odd to ask the question, should it be? But I want to get you to think about whether or not this is a normative kind of an answer. If Christianity is typical in this matter. For the King James Bible, of course, the answer is yes, it should be understood. Throughout the Protestant Reformation world, whether we're in Germany or Holland or the Scandinavian countries, the answer was yes. We should be able to understand, and they worked hard at translating the biblical text into the relevant languages. However, in medieval Catholicism, not so much. The Latin Vulgate was the text of prime importance, and everybody who sat in front and listened to it, of course, were speaking French or German or Italian or Spanish, but only a very, very small portion of them were speaking Latin and therefore could understand it. But let's broaden this before we jump on the Protestant Catholic, contretemps. Let's think about what other religions do. In Islam, the Quran is recited in Arabic in every service, even though less than 15% of Muslims can speak Arabic, and those that do speak Arabic speak a modern version, not the version that the Quran was written in. In Hinduism, with the Vedas, the priests recite the Vedas all the time, and of course, they don't understand it, and in fact, the audience doesn't understand it, and the priests themselves don't understand it. They are simply reciting by rote. And if we look at other religions like Buddhism, like Zoroastrianism, that also holds true. The notion that Scripture should be recited in its original form, in the form in which it was created, and that the audience should have the experience of listening to that original form rather than the experience of understanding the meaning that was originally intended to convey. So we have this back and forth between meaning and form. And Christianity, in this comparison, is the odd one out. The notion that translations should be used. In fact, it's been the odd one out almost from inception. Of course, Jesus spoke Aramaic. He didn't speak Greek. But when the Gospels came to be written, they were all written in Greek. So right from the beginning, Christianity has walled itself off from the original form, the original words that their God-made man spoke on this world. They've already translated into another language. When Christianity came to create a Bible made of the Old and New Testaments, they didn't go back to the Hebrew Bible, which they wanted to make into their Old Testament. Instead, they went to the Greek translation of that. Once we did that in the 4th century, Christianity went in a couple of different directions. If you look at the purple area of, this is a map of the Roman Empire, and in the purple area, that was the part of the empire that spoke Greek. And they took this Greek New Testament and this Greek Old Testament, and they used that. But if you look at the red part, that red part used Latin. And they started off translating Latin fairly early. They got Jerome, who later became Saint Jerome, to translate the entire text into Latin and later became known as the Vulgate. On the eastern end, not represented by color here, There was a number of Christians who spoke Aramaic, an Aramaic known as Syriac, and there was a major translation project into Syriac known as the Peshitta, which again included both the Old and the New Testament. So translation has been an important part of Christianity throughout its history, but it didn't start there. It started with Judaism, and Judaism translated its sacred text, and so far as I can work out, it was the first religion to translate a sacred text. It was for sure the first in the Mediterranean world, and to the best of my surveys, that it holds true for places further east as well. Translated into Greek and Aramaic, and it created not just two languages of translation, but two types of translation. And what happened with the Greek translations and how it was composed and how it was used in worship is different from what happened with the Aramaic translations. And I want to spend my time today sort of going back and forth across that a little bit, because what a translation is and how it's used sheds light on both the history of Christianity and translation in Christianity, and on the King James, and on how we still use translation in today's Christian worship. So the Greek translation begins with Alexander the Great. Alexander was born in 356 BC, and at the age of 22, he became king of Macedon, and he looked across the Aegean Sea and saw that the Persians had come all the way out to the edge of Asia Minor and were thinking about coming over and taking Greece and Macedonia. So he rounded up an army made out of Macedonians and Greeks and decided to invade the Persian Empire and drive them back. And 11 years later, when he dies in Babylon, he has completely conquered the Persian Empire and created the largest empire known until that time in the Western world. This gives you a sense. Oh, I even have a pointer. Macedonia's up here. This is where Alexander starts with his Greek army. They come into Asia Minor, retake this area, come down along Syria, Palestine, Israel here, into Egypt, and then all the way out here into what is essentially modern-day Pakistan, up into Afghanistan, and so on and so forth. So we have this huge empire, and what happens is that this becomes a Greek empire. It's administrated by Greeks. They use the Greek language to do it, and so you have a top-down system in where anybody who is important in the empire speaks and communicates with in Greek. So that means that those who want to be important rise up from below, learn how to speak Greek, learn how to communicate, and of course then that becomes part of the educational system, and so on and so forth. So 60, 70 years later, in Alexandria in Egypt, which is one of the great cities of that empire, the Jews who are living there no longer speak Hebrew. They speak Greek and Greek alone. And they decide to translate their scriptures, which are called the Torah, into Greek so they can do it. And they do a pretty good job. They get it started. Ultimately, over the decades and centuries, the rest of the Hebrew Bible will be translated. But early on, they have a problem. And that problem is that the Jews over in Israel, who still speak Hebrew, start reading this Greek translation and saying, hey, it's not the same. It's different. This is an invalid translation. This is a bad translation. You shouldn't be worshiping it, etc. So the promoters of this Greek translation, this Septuagint, have to figure out what to do, how to counter the criticisms. And the first person we know to try and counter the criticisms is an Alexandrian Jew by the name of Aristeas. And he writes a long story that we have in a text called the Letter of Aristeas. And the key point of the story is this. Ptolemy II, a pharaoh, has just created the library in Alexandria, which is the great library of the ancient world. And it only has Greek texts in it. But he hears about this great Torah of the Jews and he wants a copy. So he writes a letter to Jerusalem to the high priest at the temple and he says, hey, why don't you send me some translators? And we'll have them translate your scriptures and we'll put it in the library along with all the other great literature of our age. And so 72 men are sent by the high priest, according to Aristeas' story. They're all wise, they're all learned in every sense that you can come up with for the meaning of those two words. And they show up in Alexandria. The Pharaoh tests them. They all pass the test with flying colors about how brilliant and thoughtful and et cetera they are. And they all go out to the island of Pharos, where they have good working conditions. It's quiet, they're not being bothered by the noise of the city and so on. And every day they sit down and they pool their knowledge and their expertise and their wisdom, and in 72 days they create the Septuagint. In fact, Septuagint, if you think about it for a minute, actually comes from the word for 70, okay, referring to the translators. Now, did that work? We had this great translation made by the best of the best, 72 of the best of the best. Does that quell the criticism? No. So, about 200 years later, 150 years later, a guy by the name of Philo Judaeus, who is an Alexandrian Jew, rewrites Aristeas' story. It's pretty much the same deal, with one minor change that really changes the way the argument works. The 72 men come, they make a good impression on the Pharaoh, they go out to the island, and every day they start their work by going to the ocean, by purifying themselves with water, by praying to God for guidance that he will help them, and then each one goes to their individual shack, shed, translating hut, whatever you want to call it, and they translate for several hours, and then they come together, and it turns out that all 72 of them have it translated exactly the same. And here's what Philo has to say about that. Like men inspired, they prophesied, not one saying one thing and another saying another thing, but every one of them employed the selfsame nouns and verbs, as if some unseen prompter, hint, hint, had suggested all their language to them. In every case, exactly corresponding Greek words were employed to translate literally the appropriate Aramaic words. So the point that Philo was trying to say is that the translation is inspired. Just as much as the original Torah was inspired and given by God, so the translation is inspired and given by God. Not once, but 72 times through 72 different translators, all exactly the same. So if you think there's a difference between the Septuagint and the original Hebrew text, that's fine, because both are translated. Well, some people didn't like that spiritual answer either. So they decided to make a more accurate translation. We have Aquila, who does that in 130 AD. So we're now some almost 400 years after the original translation, still trying to fix the problem of the differences between the translation and the Hebrew. And then we have Symmachus, who comes about 50 years later, and then Theodotion. This manuscript here is a fragment of Aquila's work. So let me just pause for a minute. If we're going to say that Aquila and Theodotion and Symmachus are trying to make a more accurate translation, what exactly are they doing? What does it mean to make it more accurate? Well, the sort of standard approach that we take in recent centuries is to make the distinction between literal and paraphrase for moving the wording of the source text into the target translation. Or not moving the wording, but looking at each phrase or each sentence, trying to figure out the sense, and then restating the sense of the source text in that target translation. That's a modern idea. In antiquity, in fact, up into the Middle Ages, they really only had the notion of literal translation. And, literal could vary. There were different degrees of literal translation, but they hadn't yet really come up with the concept of paraphrase. So let's think about what literal translation means. Literal usually refers to word for word, so that each word in the original texts is represented by a word in the translation, in the target text. Now, that's okay so far, but the second point is to have the words in the same order. Now, this starts to cause an issue because most languages have different grammatical rules. Some start sentences with the verb, some start it with the subject, occasionally they start it with an object. They have different, some languages like German will always put the verb at the end of the sentence. Those of you who've been studying German and never know what the sentence means until you get to the end. And of course, German makes it even worse by writing long sentences. So that verb may be halfway down the page. So word order depends on the rules of each language. And if you start trying to make the word for word rendering be in the same word order, it often doesn't make sense in the target language. So that's another issue. And of course, a consistent representation of each word. Every time the word love appears, you always translate it, say, with the word agape, or whatever other term you want to use. Now, this creates problems. Words in different languages have different implications. What's that thing up there? That is a baseball cap.
It's a baseball cap.
We all know that. What if I want to translate this into French? Do I call it a chapeau? Is that a chapeau?
No.
No. Is it a beret?
No.
No, it's not a beret. How does French? I don't actually know the answer to this question, but my guess is that French probably just calls it a baseball cap. In other words, they give up on translation. They can't do the translation. Similarly, take the American concept weekend. Okay, in Hebrew, it would be sof and hashavua, end of the week. What do they say instead? Ha weekend. What do you say in French? Le weekend. Even though their language college, whose name I can't remember, actually came up with an official translation of that. So the implications aren't always the same. I sort of talked about this before. Correct grammar in the target language may require a word order different from the word order of the original. The more you try to make the word order the same, the less it makes sense. And this is what one of the problems with Aquila's and Symmachus' translations was, is they tried to make Greek into the word order of the Hebrew, and the more they did that, the less sense it made. And of course, idioms don't translate well. If you're translating word for word, what kind of sense do you get if you translate the bee's knees or the apple of my eye or something like that? It doesn't make any, you can translate every word, but the phrase as a whole means something, and the individual words do not add up to the meaning of that phrase. So literal in form, literal rendering does not wind up literal meaning necessarily. All right, so what did the Greek Jews do in the end? In the end, they just said, who cares? Okay, they took the practical solution, they used the Septuagint, and they essentially, since they knew no Hebrew, replaced the original text with the translation. Most of them forgot in many ways that there was a Hebrew translation. Certainly in any practical sense, they forgot that there was a translation. The Greek translation replaced the original, took on its sacred authority as if it was the original text. Christianity just copied the Jews in this, first with the Greek translation and then later with the Vulgate as well. All right, so let's talk about Aramaic. If we go back to the centuries before Alexander, for about 500 centuries, Aramaic is the main lingua franca, the diplomatic language of the ancient world. This is a picture, a map of the Persian Empire. It looks a lot like Alexander's, all the way from somewhere up in Macedonia, Asia Minor, all the way out to Pakistan. And the diplomatic language under first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians and then the Persians was Aramaic. And Aramaic was used at the top. Anybody who wanted to be anybody, to communicate with the rulers, to perhaps get a good deal for their goods or something, learned Aramaic, and thus Aramaic moved down from the ruling class down into lower classes. Alexander comes through, converts the ruler's language to Greek, and Greek starts moving down. But interestingly, Aramaic does not disappear. Instead, what happens is that it starts moving down. And by the time we get to the start of the 3rd century AD, so several hundred years later, in the Roman Empire, we have, what did I just do? Where did my map go? There we go. This area right here, all the peoples, the native peoples here, in the eastern end of the Mediterranean, they know Greek, but their real language, at least particularly of the peasants, is no longer their original language, it's Aramaic. So the Jews, for example, haven't, by the 2nd, 3rd century AD, the Jews haven't spoken Hebrew for 3, 4 centuries. They have been speaking Aramaic. So it is sort of the anti-conqueror language. It's the language of rebellion, the language of resistance, and has essentially become the native language of these people. Down here, the Nabateans speak Aramaic. Palmyrenes up here speak Aramaic. Syriac is spoken a little bit further away. And right here in the province of Syro-Palestine and Arabia, we have a number of different Jewish dialects of Aramaic being spoken as the primary language. So Jews no longer speak Hebrew, they speak Aramaic in Palestine. So they need to have their own translation. And that translation starts in the 2nd century BC, just a century or so after the Septuagint translations start. Targum, which is a particular type of translation, starts in the 1st century AD. We have some translations which seem to be in a Judean form of Aramaic, call them Targum Onkelos, Targum Jonathan. But in the 3rd century, we start a group of Targums known as the Palestinian Targums to the Torah. And we have almost, we'd have 41, 42 different manuscripts or set of manuscript fragments from different Targums of this type. And we're only just beginning to understand how they work. So I want to share with you a little bit about these. These are created differently than the Septuagint, and they're used differently than the Septuagint. On the one hand, they don't have quite so many problems as the Septuagint does. Both Hebrew and Aramaic are Semitic languages. That means they have very common word orders. They have a lot of the same lexical meanings in their words. In fact, a lot more identical words, a lot more cognates than you would find between Hebrew and Greek. And so you can actually translate with the same word order fairly easily between Hebrew and Aramaic. Okay, if you want to have an exact word-for-word translation that is literal in form and literal in meaning, you can do that 85–90% of the time between Hebrew and Aramaic. But there is a different problem, and the Targums try to wrestle with this other problem. And that is the problem of what happens when the meaning of the sentences change because of the social, religious, or cultural context in which they live. And the problem that Palestinian Targums have to deal with in particular is the destruction of the temple. If you read the Torah in Hebrew or in English translation, the Torah will tell you that the way you worship God is to offer sacrifices of animals at the temple in Jerusalem. The temple and Jerusalem are destroyed in 70 AD. The Romans banned Jews from living in the temple and then ultimately banned Jews from living in Judea. So until essentially the 20th century, there are only very, very few Jews in Palestine at all, their old ancient homeland. But there are Jews living in Galilee, okay, and that's where the Palestinian Targums are composed. But they read this text, which is their sacred text, and it tells them that they're supposed to be worshiping at the temple, which no longer exists. So they have to figure out how, on the one hand, to revere the text, but also how to make its meaning relevant to them. And that's a whole 2 or 3 or 4 lectures, so I'm not going to go into the entire thing. What I want to show you is how the idea of translation changes because of that. And let me start with a definition. A targum is a translation that combines a highly literal rendering of the original text with material added into the translation in a seamless manner. Okay, so 3 parts. Highly literal rendering of the original, material added in, not paraphrase, which is a restating of the meaning of the original in other words, but stuff that isn't there at all. It's just put in, literal with additions. So a real concern for the shape and form of the original text, but additional material as well. And can you tell the difference between the two if you don't know what the original text is? No, because they're woven together in a seamless manner. So that's the definition. Let me give you some examples, just so you can see it. Genesis 1:1. Hebrew text reads, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Targum says, from the beginning. That's just a difference in the preposition, okay? From the beginning, with wisdom, God created and finished the heavens and the earth, okay? So he created and finished. He completed it. It wasn't an unfinished job, okay? With wisdom, one Hebrew word. Anybody read Proverbs 8 recently? Proverbs 8 says that the first creation that God made was wisdom, a personified female being who worked with God and was essentially God's blueprint in the rest of creation. So this little phrase is adding in a reference to that important Proverbs passage, just so you don't forget it. Okay, these translations, by the way, are based on published translations. The Hebrew is almost always, I'm drawing from the New Revised Standard. The Targum translation, I'm usually drawing from Martin McNamara's translation or Eldon Clem's translation, but I've fiddled them so that we can compare and see the similarities and not get balled up in what choice of English words somebody made. Here's Genesis 1 through 5, just 1:5. And the italics are where we have additions in the Targum. 2 kinds of additions here. First, the word of the Lord instead of God. All right? Part of the, okay, look at this. Then God called. This asks us to imagine that God has a mouth, a voice, and he speaks. That's, sort of anthropomorphizing, making him like a human being, limiting God. Okay, and the Targums didn't like that. So they use language like the word of the Lord comes forth or is before God or whatever. There's a whole bunch of ways of trying to avoid this treatment of God, and word of the Lord is one of the ways of doing it. And then notice that essentially it's literal all the way through, and then we have an insertion of about 3 or 4 words. There was evening and there was morning in the order of the work of creation. Okay, it's not just any morning and any evening, but in the order of creation, the first day. Again, an extremely literal rendering with that word of the Lord addition. Now notice this phrase here, let it separate the waters from the waters. What waters are we talking about? We're going to have this firmament thing. Are we talking about waters on the left and the right? Are we talking waters in the front and the back? The Targum says the lower waters and the upper waters. How do you know? Water flows down, and there must be something, the ocean. What's underneath the ocean? Nothing. Can't get to the bottom, right? And of course, there's waters up there. How do you know? That's where rain comes from. Okay? Windows of the heavens open, according to the Noah story, and the water comes down. So any logical person can see that there has to be waters below, waters above. And the Targum tells us that, just in case you were wondering. Here's 2:15. 2 added words here. Complete change of meaning. Okay? Extremely literal. The Hebrew reads, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. Targum, very literal. The Lord God took Adam and put him in the Garden of Eden to be working. Went passive there, okay? Students, don't do that in your papers. And then we add 2 words, to be working in the Torah and to keep its commandments. So rather than a passage about minding the garden, hoeing and tilling and keeping it and, looking after it, this is now a commandment from God to Adam to work in the Torah, to do Torah, and to keep its commandments. Okay, and that winds up changing the entire story of Adam and Eve, because by the end, it's not that Adam hasn't obeyed God by eating the wrong fruit, it's that Adam has disobeyed God because he didn't keep the Torah. And part of the Torah was not to eat the right fruit. So this is essentially the basis for completely recasting and rethinking the meaning of the Adam and Eve story. Let me just give you one of the curses from the end of that story, just to give you a sense. Here's the Hebrew. The entire Hebrew is down here, and we insert a sentence. Some of you may know the old rabbinic story. It's a great passage in later rabbinic literature, and they're listing people who will go to hell. Okay, and they mention the Amalekites, and they mention Og of Bashan, who wouldn't let the Israelites walk through his land on the way to when they were trying to come out of Egypt. And there's this list of people, and then about a good ways down there are those who deny that the day of judgment and resurrection is in the Torah. If you actually sit down and read the Torah, it isn't there. Okay? So this is a problem for the rabbis, for early Judaism, who of course want it there. But the Targumus, he puts it there, so you don't have to worry about it. And so here we are, going along with the translation, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return, but from dust you will return and rise up, there's the resurrection, and give a judgment and an account for all that you have done. And then we go right back to literal. Then Adam called the name of his wife Eve, etc., etc. So literal translation, insert a sentence, go right back to literal translation. All right. So let's think about this for a minute. And one of the ways to understand this is to understand it in terms of how it was used in the liturgy. Because unlike the Septuagint, which wound up replacing the Hebrew text. The rabbis were a little bit worried about this form of translation, and so required an antiphonal reading, that you would have the Torah with you in the service. Somebody would read the Hebrew, and somebody else would then give the translation. 3 verses of Hebrew, 3 verses of translation, 3 verses of Hebrew, 3 verses of translation. Sort of a call and response kind of a setup, if you think of your musical terminology. Now, what I'd like to do is give you a bit of an example of how that might work. Just one reader. I'm gonna play Reuben the reader one time, and then I'll be Tom the translator, and just give you a sense how it was used in the liturgy. Because unlike the Septuagint, which wound up replacing the Hebrew text, the rabbis were a little bit worried about this form of translation, and so required an antiphonal reading, that you would have the Torah with you in the service. Somebody would read the Hebrew, and somebody else would then give the translation. 3 verses of Hebrew, 3 verses of translation, 3 verses of Hebrew, 3 verses of translation. Sort of a call and response kind of a setup, if you think of your musical terminology. Now, what I'd like to do is give you a bit of an example of how that might work. Just one reader. I'm gonna play Reuben the reader one time, and then I'll be Tom the translator, and just give you a sense of the difference between the two and how they're treated. So, and I want you to watch, okay? Watch how this works. Adonai ro'eh lo eksar b'na'ot deshe yarbitzeni. Al mai menuchot yenachalaini, nafshi yoshevei yenacheni b'ma'alei tzedek lema'an shemo. Okay, that was Reuben the reader. Now I'm going to be Tom the translator. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down by the lake. He leadeth me in the bike paths of the trails of righteousness. He restoreth my soul. Okay, now, what did you see? What's the difference between the two? The reader, Ralph the reader, Reuben the reader, and Tom the translator. What's the difference? What did you see?
One is really fluid, and the other, you just can hardly track with it.
Okay, which is fluid?
The one you can't understand.
Okay, the one you can't understand, the Torah reading. Okay, that's fluid. You had your hand up?
I was going to say the translator struggled.
Okay. Okay, you could. Okay, the translator probably has it by memory. Okay, he's struggling to do a good job.
One seems to be reading from the script and the other is improvised.
Okay, one has a text. Okay. Got my Torah. All right, my Biblia Hebraica. You know, if I was doing this right, I would have had a scroll. Okay, and we would have done it right, but it gives you that there's a text there. It is present. The Torah text is present.
The second speaker gave alternative translations as possibilities, or admitted that he may have made a mistake and corrected it.
Okay, all right. Yes.
You kiss the Torah.
Okay, I kiss the Torah. What does that suggest?
Adoration.
adoration, sacrality, etc. Did you see the translation?
No.
No, you didn't see the translation. You saw the Torah text, but you didn't see the translation. What about my dress? What does that tell you?
You're not a rabbi.
Okay, I'm not a rabbi. Thank you. That's good. But what I want you to think about is when I read, I was formal. Okay, I had a nice black coat on. My tie was right. I don't think I'm going to get it right again. Definitely not. And as a translator, okay, I don't have to be quite so formal. A little bit disheveled. Maybe I'm, maybe I don't own nicer clothes. Maybe that was my good clothes. Maybe I don't know how to dress up right. So there's a difference here. But I can do that as a translator, okay? I'm not being disrespectful to the Torah text. But let's think about this for a minute. Where did the meaning come from?
The translation.
The meaning comes from the translation, not from the Torah, because the whole reason for having a translation is because you don't understand the original language of the Torah. So what the rabbis did in this kind of situation with a Targum translation is they set it up so that the text with the status is the Torah. It's present. It's actually here. It's the only text there is. But the meaning of what they understand comes from the memory of the translator, and the text he's memorized is the Targum. So there's a back and forth here. Status with the original text, you get to hear the form, you get to hear it read out loud, but the meaning, to the extent that you know the meaning, you know it from the Targum. People see that difference? Michael?
The presentation suggests a simultaneous translation rather than a memorization.
It does, as I've done it. However,
That wasn't the case.
well, think about it this way, okay? If you need to do a translation because people don't understand the original language, and by the time we're writing Targums, this Hebrew is perhaps 1,000 years old, so it's not even a current if there was a current, to the extent that people know a current dialect, it's not that dialect. This is the way it's done in every big city and in every synagogue in a small village. Most of the people in small villages are going to be farmers, they're going to be laborers. You might be lucky if you have one or two people who can read any language at all. So if there is going to be knowledge, it's going to have to be memorized. This isn't a world of professional translators who can translate on the spot like they work for the UN. Okay? Yes?
If I understood you correctly, you were saying that the translator had memorized the Targum,
Yes.
but why doesn't he have a copy? Is it that?
Because he can't read.
Oh, okay.
Can't, I mean, two things. One is he can't read. Other thing is, the reason not to have a copy of the translation, I'm probably prepared perhaps from a written translation. Somebody in town, I would presume, had a written translation and worked with him or something. But the whole point here is to honor the Torah. By not having a translation text, the only text in the room is the sacred one, not the translation. So what we're trying to do is not replace the translation and stick it in place of the original text. We're trying to have the original text and the translation at the same time, unlike the Septuagint, where the translation replaces the original text. Okay, let me wind this up. So, just a quick review, which work has the higher status? Obviously the Torah. It was treated in a dignified and respectful manner. It was read. I tried to dress formally and respectfully, and it was actually present. It was here. The translation is what gave meaning. And its meaning was authorized by the presence of the text. Okay, the fact that we read it back and forth, it isn't the Torah, but it is next to the Torah. Okay, so that is seen implicitly as a sign of approval. The additional material that's in the Targum that I explained to you, if you don't understand the Hebrew, then you don't know what is added and what is not. The interpretation takes on the same status as the original. The Targum creates the text as meaning what it is supposed to mean. Okay, in many ways, some of the things that we saw there are there to avoid questions by, say, putting in lower and upper waters. That avoids the question of where the waters are. You don't have to think about it because the question's already answered, and you don't know that it's even was an issue. So what about translation of modern Christianity, just to pull this together? Is the practice of translation more like the Septuagint or more like the Targum? And let's ignore that last question there. With regard to the Targums, their meaning replaced the Torah. It was authorized by the presence of the Torah, but the Targum text itself was absent. The Septuagint replaced the Torah in its meaning and in its physical presence. This wholesale substitution can work only if the translation gets the entire authority of the original. The original is absent because the translation now has that authority. So for the King James Bible, for other modern translations, what do we see? Like the Septuagint, the King James replaced the original text, usurping its status, usurping its authority, and making its meaning the meaning of the original text. For most of its existence, this was not seen as controversial, unlike the Septuagint, which seemed to be fighting that battle for centuries and centuries. The King James Bible and now other translations are simply accepted as the original text and giving both its meaning and authority. Thank you very much. Before I answer some questions, this is the website where Religious Studies has the list of speakers. As you can see in the back that we are filming, and as the films become available for streaming, we will put links up there so you can watch them. They'll be up to a film on YouTube in the Wyoming Videos section. If you're interested in learning more about Targum, I did some off-prints of one of my articles, which is about Targum in Scripture and in movies and even in Harry Potter movies. So if you want to pick up one of those, I made a few copies. Are there any questions?
Do you want to moderate your own? You're welcome to.
I can.
Okay.
Is that okay? All right. All right. Yes.
I've been watching some history on Henry VII through King James, and wasn't the King, I guess I got a lot of this from the last speaker.
Okay.
But wasn't King James coming from previous translations that had been very controversial?
Yes.
And did, in a way, couldn't you say it was the end of the line? I mean, that there was controversy over English translations, but by the time of the King James Bible, it was time for it to all die down or something?
You could put it that way. Less than a century before, it had been a crime to translate the Bible into English, a crime punishable by death. William Tyndale was actually executed in 1536 for making English translations. 3 years later, the law has changed. Henry VIII, who had him executed, now is issuing the Great Bible as authorized version, and it happens to be based to a large extent on Tyndale's translations. There's 2 or 3 other versions. The most important ones are the Bishop's Bible, which was supposedly the official Bible of the Anglican Church. It was just a lousy translation. It did not speak to the people at all. It was sort of an academese and heavily academics who spoke Latin. And then, of course, there was the Geneva Bible that was made by the Puritans who fled from Queen Mary and her persecution of the Puritans. And they did a Bible in Geneva in English called the Geneva Bible. And the problem with the Geneva Bible was that it was anti-monarchical. And King James believed in the divine right of kings to rule. And everybody should shut up and do what he asked them to, because that's the right that God gave him. And so he didn't like the Geneva Bible. So the King James is actually an attempt to create a translation that is pro-monarchy, pro-establishment, and it, by the way, has no interpretive footnotes, just so there's no place to put those kinds of things in. So does that answer your question? Yes, Chris.
If the Targum takes the authority of the original, of the Septuagint, or the original, who decides which Targum is authoritative?
Very good question. Who decides which Targum is authoritative? That is a matter of debate over a number of centuries. My favorite Targums, the Palestinian Targums, were used widely in Galilee and in northern Palestine, southern Syria, that area. They were not liked by the rabbinical authorities. There's a lot of passages in rabbinical literature sort of trying to diss them in some way or another. And then they sort of get their chance in the Babylonian Talmud, which is published in about the start of the 7th century, 600 AD. And they have a nice passage where essentially they're talking about the requirement to translate in the synagogue, and they're talking about a man and his spouse, his beloved betrothed woman, and the question really is, okay, if he says, "I'll be betrothed to you when I can read Torah," that's the question. And the question is, what does it mean to read Torah? So the rabbis say, first of all, he has to be able to read the Hebrew. And then they say, well, he has to be able to give the translation. And then they say, what translation does he have to give? And they say, our translation, which means Targum Onkelos, not the Palestinian Targums. Other questions? Yes?
You pointed out that antiquity, they were very worried about translation errors. How far back does a concern about transcription error go? Is that a modern concern, or were they worried about that?
There is a recognition of the problems of transcription quite early on. Just transcribing, making copies of these texts, because of course they didn't have Xerox machines or anything like that. All the copies had to be by hand. And we have a pattern of scribal stuff back into the 2nd, 3rd century BC of scribes looking at their text, not just copying it, but looking at it and deciding, oh, I think those words are wrong, and then fixing them, whether they were wrong or not. And then when we get, the Hebrew Bible has an authoritative text, but that text is called the Masoretic text, and it comes from about the 9th, 10th century AD. And what makes that authoritative is this group known as the Masoretes worked out a set of notations in the margins, that essentially prevented this kind of fixing, flagged unusual forms and said, this is the right form. It occurs 3 other times, for example. And from about the 8th or 9th century, we have an extremely stable Hebrew text. It essentially stops changing at that point. unlike almost any other text that's been copied through the Middle Ages, at least that I'm aware of. And in fact, Targum Onkelos gets its own Masorah, its own set of notes to prevent it from changing. So it's moving towards the status of Scripture because of its rabbinic approval. Yes?
Decades ago, a Old Testament scholar told our class that the term 40 days and 40 nights is nothing more or nothing less than a Hebrew idiom for a long time.
Could be. I don't know the specific answer to that. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, it is standard, and Hebrew often does that with numbers. So, for example, they'll give you a number that has thousands in it, and it just sort of, I mean, it's like saying infinity. That's not an exact term anymore. So I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know that specific one. Yes, sir.
Would being the interpreter when you were doing the reading and the interpreter, is that a position of status? Is that a rotating position? Is that a rabbi? Who's actually doing that?
Originally, the reader and the translator are both positions of the community. You have to be a little bit better dressed to be a reader. You have to be older. But essentially, these are positions which ideally are shared among the community. However, in terms of status, they're both. It is good. It is a religious good thing to actually to do either one. But it is a higher status to be a reader. So if a father and son are reader and translator, the father is always the reader. Can't go the other way. Yes?
And then back in the original translations at the beginning, I know that in current day Israel, they sometimes have trouble with words that exist now that don't have a Hebrew equivalent. Did they run into that kind of a difficulty?
As I understand it, you're referring to what those of us who know call a hapax legomenon. Okay, now, hapax legomenon, okay? It's a great word to drop at a party, all right? Make you seem intelligent. The hapax legomenon is a word that shows up only once in Scripture or in the texts. And the problem with that is that in order to understand what a word means, you need it to be used multiple times in many different sentences, and you can get a sort of a sense. If it's only used once, then you can sort of get a general idea, but it's hard to sort of pin it down more closely. And sometimes you don't even get a general idea. So you get, there are probably several hundred. And the Targumists love them because they get to make it up. So sometimes there are standard equivalents, because people ask, I don't understand that word. What does it mean? And so there are standard equivalents for a lot of them that sort of have an answer. And often I think the Targumist is simply using one of those sort of standard responses. But sometimes they just, it's just a great excuse to stick in a paragraph or two and elaborate the story and really go with it. Yes, sir?
You said that by the time they were doing the translation, the Hebrew they were using might have been 1,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Did the person reading it actually know what he was reading?
No.
Or was it just wrote?
A lot of it probably.
Memorized it, or knew how to pronounce the word, but that was it.
The issue of reading in antiquity is a very interesting issue, but probably it was rote. But let me just sort of fill you in a little bit. Hebrew as a language, when you write Hebrew, the earliest written Hebrew texts are only consonants. The alphabet has only consonants, it has no vowels. And no punctuation and no word separation. So when you are reading a text, what you're doing is looking at a set of codes and then adding in the sounds, the correct sounds that aren't indicated there. You are dividing up the words, you are sticking in the vowels, and Hebrew is based on a three-letter root system, and what that means is you put in different vowels and you come up with different words. So if you one set of vowels will give you a noun, another set of vowels will give you a past tense verb, different set of vowels will give you a future verb, and so on. So the reader has to figure all of that out, and essentially what that means is you practice and you memorize, much the way the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah boy or girl today literally figures out the coding of the passage they're reading and memorizes what sounds go with that coding and rehearses in front of the rabbi, in order to do it. Understanding the meaning of what they're reading is not necessary.
So we didn't understand that.
Quite often that is probably correct. Yes?
I'm just wondering if there's any priority given to, in the translation of the Targum, to the beauty of the language involved or the application of the text to life, or was it just pure clarity in what was being communicated?
One of my frustrations with the Targum is that it's not consistent. Some passages, yeah, they're going for the beauty of the language, and other times they're just going for practicality. Think about reading through some of the laws, like in Leviticus 21 or 22, or someplace like that. That isn't beautiful language even in the Hebrew. It's sort of short and terse, and if your bull gets loose and gets into somebody else's field and impregnates their cow, or breaks their pots, or ruins the fence, who's liable? That's not great prose. And while they may do something to make sure the law is clear, because often legal problems have to do with imprecise language in the law, and so the Targumist will often clarify some of those uncertain points. But again, they don't seem to be consistent. They go from exegetical things to beauty, to making the law plain, to just, poetry is a great one. Almost any poetic passage will get a lot of additional material and rewriting for whatever reason. It doesn't have to be, but it seems to be a signal to the Targumist to just sort of say all sorts of interesting stuff. Yes, sir.
I understood what you said about the coding of the Hebrew.
Mhm.
I guess the part that's confusing to me is how could you know how to break it down if you didn't know what you were saying? You just memorized the passage and he's told you how it's, okay.
Yes. This is all about education. And education in antiquity involved a lot of memorization. And it's something that very few people did. In the ancient world, I would estimate that no more than 5 or 6% of adult males could read. Certainly not read anything significant like literature or something like that. So this is high-level training. The people who can read and write have a serious education by ancient standards and are really the sort of standouts educationally in their community.
But he could still not know the Hebrew. He just knows it's this set of vowels goes with this part of the phrase because he's told him and he's memorized the phrase even though he doesn't know what it says. Okay.
Yes, I mean, there are going to be a lot of people who do know Hebrew, but those are the ones with a real serious education, who had the money, whose parents had the money and the wealth to keep, so they didn't have to work in the fields, 6 days a week, so that they weren't out farming or whatever, that they actually had the time and the energy to learn this kind of thing. We switched to universal education in our country at the start of the 20th century, and we've forgotten the fact that the government pays for all this stuff. That's a huge investment that we make. If you ever looked at Wyoming's budget, most of its budget is education, both higher education and K through 12. You know, that's our investment in our human capital. And in the ancient world, they didn't do that. So most people, you know, worked 6-7 days a week, and very few people had the money to afford to go to school or the time.
I think if maybe Paul can stay if others of you have more questions, but I think we'll close the formal part of our lecture tonight. And please give Paul a very great thank you.